Hello everyone, how are we all doing out there? So, Phyrexia, All Will Be One has given us a ton of new cards, and among them we have some amazing new commander options. One of my personal favorites is Karumonix the Rat King. Karumonix is a 3/3 for 3 mana, and we're in mono black. He has Toxic 1, so whenever he deals combat damage to a player, they get 1 poison counter. A player with 10 or more poison counters loses the game. It also gives all of our other rat creatures Toxic 1, so if a creature already has a toxic ability, this adds 1 point to it, increasing the poison counters they dish out. Karumonix also has one final ability. When he enters the battlefield, you can look at the top 5 cards of your library. If there are any rat creatures among them, you can reveal any number of them, add them to your hand, the rest get randomly placed on the bottom of your library. Karumonix is a pretty straightforward rat tribal deck. We've gotten a few spicy rat cards over the last couple of years that have had me itching to make a deck around them. As the resident goth of the Magic community, I think it would be fitting to build a deck around such a cute but macabre tribe. One of this deck's little zests is that I'm also running Rat Colony, specifically 22 copies of Rat Colony. Rat Colony is one of the handful of cards in Magic that breaks the card limit rules, so you can add as many Rat Colony cards to your commander deck as you want. This 2-drop gets +1/+0 for each other rat you control, and given this deck runs 29 rat cards, these run the potential to get huge. We also run a number of ways to make these hard to block, and as long as our commander is in play, these creatures also get toxic. I guess a good name for this deck would be the Bubonic Plague. Because we're running so many Rat Colony, we have 2 cards in this deck that literally only work in a deck like this: Thrumming Stone and Secret Salvage. Thrumming Stone is a 4-mana artifact that gives your spells Ripple 4. Ripple 4 triggers whenever you cast a spell, letting you reveal the top 4 cards of your library, and any spells that share a name with the cast spell can also be cast for free. Because we run so many Rat Colony cards, we want to hit at least one other Rat Colony each time we get that Ripple 4 effect. This can help our board state pop off in a tremendous manner, and because of the individual self buff that these cards have, the Rat Colonies can become huge. Secret Salvage is a 5-drop sorcery that allows you to exile a rat colony from your graveyard to add any number of other cards named Rat Colony from your library to your hand. 5 mana to draw up to 21 cards is a pretty decent payoff. We also run a few other legendary rats. Ash Coat of the Shadow Swarm is a pretty solid option for a rat tribal commander deck as well, acting as a sort of Craterhoof behemoth for our rats. Whenever it attacks or blocks, your entire board of rats gets +X/+X until the end of turn, where X is the number of rats you control. And at the beginning of your end step, you can take up to 2 rat creature cards from your graveyard and add them to your hand. This card has such utility in the deck, giving our board either a substantially harder bite or it can act as a constant recursion spell. Finally, we have Marrow-Gnawer, who gives our rats fear. Fear is similar to the Intimidate keyword, but it's a lot older, and I do believe it's been phased out of modern keyword usage. Creatures that have fear can only be blocked by creatures that are either black or colorless. If we have Marrow-Gnawer out, our rats are largely going to be unblockable. I've even gone the extra mile and added in Cover of Darkness to double up on the fear granting ability. We can also use Marrow-Gnawer to sacrifice a rat and then create a number of rat tokens equal to the number of rats we already control. This synergizes really nicely with Ash Coat, as that sacrificed rat can then be returned to our hand at the end step, and we're going to be swinging for a lot more damage. These 2 legendary rats can be substituted in for Karumonix should we want to change up the feel of the deck. It largely will function the same, but sometimes you do want to keep the threat of Toxic secret, since Toxic and Infect generally bring around a lot of hate to your side of the field. In terms of non-legendary rats, we have several very valuable rodents. My personal favorite among them is Crypt Rats, who has Infect, but also gives each player a poison counter upon it entering the battlefield. This can get the ball moving if you need to give each player a counter to proliferate upon later, and the fact it doesn't even need to attack to deliver the counter makes this even more value. One thing to note is if Crypt Rats has been given Toxic 1 by our commander, it will give 1 poison counter from its Toxic ability on top of the poison counters it gives from its Infect. Crypt Rats is a nice finisher that can be used in conjunction with something like Grafted Exoskeleton to finish the board in 1 lethal hit. One of the biggest differences between Toxic and Infect is Toxic will only work if the creature deals combat damage. With Infect, any damage that a creature deals to a player will give poison counters. So Crypt Rats burning opponents for X means if you have enough mana to finish off a player, you could sink it into the rats for lethal. and this even applies if it doesn't have infect. You can use this as a board wipe to clear off the board. We also have many ways of getting our board state back should our rats be wiped out. More on that later though. Pack Rats is a really interesting card that acts as a rat producer. Its power of toughness is equal to the size of your rat army, and you can pay 3 and pitch a card to get a copy of itself, giving you another rat. This is a pretty simple beater card. It gets big, it helps us establish board state should we have some dead cards in hand, and as I stated a moment ago, we have ways of getting our stuff out of the grave. Piper of the Swarm gives our rats menace. As if giving them fear wasn't enough, their having menace makes them even more difficult to block. Sure, your opponents might actually have a creature to block our rats if they have fear, but do they have enough to block our board that now has menace? Piper of the Swarm also has 2 activated abilities, one that can generate a rat token and the other that allows us to sacrifice 3 rats to take control of a target creature. This can be such a huge swing in our favor, stealing whatever the biggest threat is permanently. This is a great usage of some of those creature tokens created by something like Ratnar to trade in for something that our opponents would have otherwise used against us. As a sort of game ender and fringe case pet card, we have Plague of Vermin, who can generate us tons of rats. It sits right at the top of our mana curve, and it allows players to take turns paying life. Whenever they stop, each player then creates 1/1 rat tokens for each 1 life that they individually paid. It isn't quite like Join Forces, but you can use this to drop a few life, create a swarm of tokens, all of which could have anything from fear to menace, toxic, and then threaten the table with a complete blowout. I play this as a very high risk, high reward style finisher. So I mentioned before we have a means to get our creatures back from the graveyard. We have 4. Perhaps the most basic of them is the Whip of Erebos, who gives our board lifelink. This means those gigantic rats that we cast can bump our life totals up to astronomical heights. We can also pay 4 to reanimate any creature from our graveyard for the turn, and give it haste. We can only use this ability during our turn, but it's more than worth it if we can go off. We also have Patriarch's Bidding, which lets each player pick a creature type and lets them reanimate all of the creatures of that type from the graveyard. This is a fantastic way to bounce back after a board wipe, and if that isn't enough, we run Living Death, which functions as a board wipe and a reanimation spell. See, I'm less concerned about maintaining a board state of creatures if I can bring them back, and so cards like Mutilate doesn't faze me as much to add in. If I can get a small handful of buffed up rats into play and my opponents have nothing to block, that's going to end better for me. And if somehow the majority of our rats end up in the graveyard, we do keep Forever Young at the ready to not only put all of them back on top, but it draws us a card. This can be a great setup to a huge turn with the Thrumming Stone line should we line up our rat colonies properly. I do also have a little fun board wipe of sorts in the form of Torment of Hailfire. It doesn't really synergize with the rat strategy per se, but one of the first rat cards I ever owned was Ravenous Rats, who makes an opponent discard a card. Torment of Hellfire does that too in a much more grander sense. It can also be very advantageous to strip an opponent of the majority of their resources, and so I always like to slide this into black decks that I can manage to. It just feels like it's on flavor. On the subject of game enders, we have the aforementioned Torment of Hailfire, which if it gets enough mana channeled into it, can take out opponents. We also have Ayara, First of Locthwain, who synergizes fantastically with the Plague of Vermin. She has something of a reverse Blood Artist ability where wherever a black creature enters our battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, and then we gain 1 life. We can also utilize her for card draw, but that's not what we're getting at with her. This deck is all about getting creatures out, and so we will ping the opponent for each creature we get out. That Plague of Vermin I mentioned earlier becomes a net neutral life swing for us, but will scorch our opponents while Ayara is out. Grey Merchant of Asphodel is pretty much a staple in mono black decks, allowing you to raise opponents for your devotion to black, which should be substantial, and gain you all that life lost. No, it's not a rat, but given our deck has a ton of black mana pips, it's a great way to end the game should the combat strategy fail. Our main game plan is technically to go big with our rats. We get out a bunch of rats, make them incredibly difficult to block, and that should be enough to take out opponents. Given the speed that we can thin our deck out using the Thrumming Stone line, a lot of the rest of the deck should become a lot more consistent. One of the nastiest means to make our board state untouchable is through Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and Filth. Filth gives our creatures Swamp Walk as long as we control a swamp and it rests in the graveyard, easily done with a ton of discard abilities, and Urborg makes every land a swamp. It's simple, yet effective. We have enough card draw and tutor abilities to get the Rat Colony Thriving Stone line going, but if we need to pivot to a slower poison counter style play, we do have cards like Phyrexia, Outbreak, Yawgmoth, and a few other proliferate cards to get our opponents up to 10 counters. So what do you think of this deck? I'm happy to see some new tribal builds popping up here and there, and as we get the new sets, I think Rats have finally gotten enough options for Commander that they can join the fray with a little more consistency. If you like this video, consider leaving a thumbs up and subscribing, and I hope to see you in the next video.